On the night of December 29th, 1944, somewhere in the black sky over the Philippine Sea, 4 Japanese aircraft were flying home. The men inside them were not afraid. They had no reason to be. It was the darkest hour of a moonless night, and for 2 years the darkness had belonged to them. American fighters could not see at night. Everyone knew that every pilot in the Imperial Japanese forces knew that the night was the one place a man could still fly and expect to land. One, they stopped answering their radio. There was no warning, no searchlight, no tracer arcing up from a warship. Nothing came out of the dark to tell them what was happening. And nothing came out of the dark to tell the men still flying that they should turn around. So they did not turn around. They kept flying straight and level toward a home they would never see, while something enormous and silent and painted the color of nothing at all closed to within a few hundred feet of their tails. The men in that machine had less than 20 seconds of ammunition. They would need only a fraction of it. Bedam, 4 aircraft were gone, and not one of the men who died that night ever knew what killed them. I'm glad you're here today. What state are you watching from? Mindoro is a small island, and in December of 1944 it was the most important piece of ground in the Pacific. It sat 200 miles south of Manila, a green smear of jungle and coral and shallow water. And until that winter, almost no one in America had ever heard of it. Then the engineers came ashore. They came with bulldozers and steel matting and crushed coral hauled up from the beach. And they began carving airstrips out of the ground near a village called San Jose. The strips were not for bombers. They were not for anything glamorous. They were for fighters, short-ranged fighters that could take off from Mindoro, fly north, and cover the men who would soon wait ashore at a place called Lingayen Gulf. Everything depended on those strips. The invasion depended on them. The men who would land in January depended on them, and the men building them were sleeping in canvas tents pitched along the beach, no more than a few hundred yards from the runway, with nothing over their heads but mosquito netting. The Japanese understood this perfectly. They could not stop the engineers by day. By day, the sky over Mindoro belonged to the American Navy and the American Army Air Forces, and anything with a red circle on its wings that came into that sky came in to die. So the Japanese stopped coming by day. They came at night, night after night after night. They came sometimes 1 aircraft, sometimes a dozen. They came from Luzon, and they came from the Visayas, and they came out of the black without warning. The searchlights would grope at the sky and find nothing. The anti-aircraft batteries would fire at sounds. The engineers would roll out of their cots and into slit trenches full of warm rainwater and lie there listening to engines they could not see, waiting to find out whether the bombs were meant for them. And in the morning, the engineers would climb out and count the craters, count the wrecked bulldozers, count the men. This was the arithmetic of Mindoro in the last week of 1944. Every night the Japanese arrived, and every morning the schedule slipped a little further, and every day the schedule slipped meant more Americans would die in January on the beaches at Lingayen. Nothing the Americans had could touch an aircraft at night. That is not quite true. That is what everyone believed on both sides, and it had been true for most of the war. But a few days before Christmas, a small unit had come up from the south. Its ground crews had come by ship from Leyte. Its aircraft had flown up from Morotai by way of Tacloban, arriving over the coral strip in 1s and 2s. And they had parked at the far end of the field where nobody had to look at them. They were the ugliest airplanes anyone on Mindoro had ever seen. The unit was the 418th Night Fighter Squadron. Its commanding officer was a major named Carroll Smith. You would not have picked him out of a group photograph. He was not the youngest man in the squadron, and he was not the loudest, and he did not talk the way fighter pilots in the movies talk. He had come up through the war in a branch of the service that almost nobody understood and almost nobody wanted. Night fighting was not flying. Night fighting was sitting in a dark box for 3 hours, doing arithmetic, while a machine told you things you could not see. Smith had one quality that mattered more than any other, and it was a quality he was honest enough to name out loud. He was not a good shot. He said so himself. Later, in the flat way of a man reporting a mechanical fact about himself, his marksmanship, he said, improved in direct relation to how close he got to a target before he pulled the trigger. There was no boast in it. It was a confession, and it was also a method. If a man cannot shoot well from far away, then he must go nearer than is sensible. Near enough that missing becomes physically difficult. Near enough that when the enemy aircraft comes apart, the pieces come back at him. That was Major Carroll Smith, a commanding officer who flew because his squadron had been on the island for less than a week and there was nobody else to send in an airplane. Nobody respected using a method that amounted to walking up and putting the muzzle against the other man's ribs. Behind him and slightly below him sat a lieutenant named Philip Porter. Porter was the radar observer. In the Black Widow, the radar observer did not sit beside the pilot. He sat in his own compartment further back along the fuselage, in a space about the size of a coffin stood on its end. He had a small canopy of his own. He almost never looked through it. There was nothing to see through it. What Porter looked at for hour after hour was a circular glass screen, the color of pond water, on which small bright shapes appeared and faded and appeared again. Understand what this means, because everything that happened that night comes out of it. Philip Porter never once laid eyes on the enemy. Not that night. Not any night. He found them. He stalked them. He closed the distance on them. He put the guns on them. And he never saw a single one of them with his own eyes. He saw a glowing smear on a piece of glass somewhere out in the dark. That smear was an airplane with men inside it. Men who had names and families, men who were cold and tired and thinking about morning. Porter never learned what any of them looked like. The man in the front seat pulled the trigger. The man in the back seat did the hunting. The airplane they flew was called the Black Widow, and it was the strangest combat aircraft of the Second World War. It was enormous, 66 feet from wingtip to wingtip, which is almost exactly the wingspan of a Mitchell medium bomber. It had 2 tail booms and 2 engines and a crew gondola slung between them. And it weighed as much as a small house. 2 Pratt and Whitney double wasp radial engines hung on the wings, 2,000 horsepower each. And even with all that power, the thing could barely make 366 miles an hour flat out. It was painted gloss black, not olive drab, not gray, black and polished, because a matte finish caught searchlight beams and a glossy one let them slide off from 50 feet away on a moonless night. A Black Widow was a hole in the world, and in its nose, behind a plastic cone, was the reason it existed. The radar was called the SCR-720. It was a rotating dish that swept 180 degrees across the sky ahead of the aircraft, throwing out pulses of microwave energy and listening for what came back. At altitude, it could find an airplane 5 miles away in absolute darkness. 5 miles. In 1944, this was closer to sorcery than to engineering, and it was the most closely guarded secret the squadron had. The Japanese did not know it existed. That is the whole story. Right there. In that one sentence, they flew at night because they believed the night made them invisible. They were correct about the night. They were wrong about the machine. But the radar had a flaw, and the flaw is the thing you must hold in your mind for the next hour, because it shaped every second of what happened over the Philippine Sea. The SCR-720 could see 5 miles. It could not see the last few hundred feet. Below that range, the returning pulse came back before the set had finished listening for it. and the target simply vanished from the scope, it went blind. It went blind at exactly the distance at which a man like Carroll Smith needed to shoot. And there was a second blindness, older and simpler than the first. A radar return is a smear of light. It has a range and a bearing, and nothing else. It cannot tell you the shape of what it has found, or the color of the markings on its wings, or whether the men inside it are Japanese or American. The rules were absolute on this point. A man did not fire into the dark at something he had not seen with his own eyes. So the hunt worked like this. Out at 5 miles, the machine could see and the men could not. Porter would call the corrections, left 3 degrees, down 2, and Smith would fly them. Blind on instruments into the dark, closer, 2 miles, 1 mile, half a mile. And then, in the last few hundred yards, the radar stopped being able to tell him the one thing he needed, and Carroll Smith would lift his eyes from the instrument panel and look out through the windscreen into total blackness. And everything after that depended on whether he could make out a shape against a slightly less black sky. Radar brought you to the door. It did not walk you through it. There was more the Japanese did not know, and some of it would have surprised them. The Black Widow had been designed with a gun turret on its back, 4 heavy machine guns that could swivel and fire in any direction. It was the airplane's most famous feature, and it barely worked. When the guns turned, the disturbed air ran straight back into the tail and shook the whole aircraft. The problem was studied. The problem was never solved. On many of the Black Widows fighting in the Pacific, the turret was simply taken off and the whole plated over. And on most of the rest, it was locked, facing forward, and forgotten. What was left were 4 cannons in the belly, 20-millimeter Hispano cannons, mounted low, so that the muzzle flash would not blind the pilot at the instant he needed his eyes. Most 200 rounds for each gun, 800 rounds in all. Now do the arithmetic that Carroll Smith did before every mission. Those cannons fire at roughly 650 rounds a minute. Each 800 rounds, divided among 4 guns, fired at that rate, comes out to something in the neighborhood of 20 seconds. 20 seconds. For the whole night, for every target, for everything, a man had 4 cannons and a magic box and an airplane too slow to catch most of what it was sent to kill, and he had 20 seconds of it. And after that, he was flying a very large, very black, very expensive airplane with nothing on board but 2 frightened men and the fuel to get home. The engineers finished laying coral for the day. The sun went down behind Mindoro at a little after 6. Along one edge of the strip, a work crew set out a row of kerosene lamps, 12 or so, spaced out in a line, and lit them one at a time. At the far end of the field, 2 men climbed into a black airplane somewhere to the north, out over the water. Other men were climbing into their own airplane, unhurried, unafraid, going to work in the one place on Earth where they still believed nobody could reach them. The Black Widow does not leap off the ground. It leaves reluctantly, the way something that heavy has to leave, and the kerosene lamps went past under the wing one at a time, and then there were no more lamps. And Carroll Smith was flying into a color that has no name. There was no moon. There was no horizon. Below him, the sea and the sky met somewhere, and he could not have told you where. The instrument panel glowed faintly. The artificial horizon and the altimeter and the turn and bank indicator, small green pools of light in a black cave. And outside the windscreen was a wall of nothing that pressed against the glass. Men who had never flown at night did not understand this. They imagined darkness as a kind of gray. It is not gray. Over open ocean, on a night with cloud above and no moon, a man can look out of a cockpit for an hour and see literally nothing. And if he stops trusting his instruments for even a few seconds, His inner ear will tell him he is turning when he is level, climbing when he is diving, and it will kill him without any help from the enemy at all. Behind him, Philip Porter switched on the radar and waited for the tube to warm. The two men were less than 10 feet apart, and they might as well have been in separate countries. Smith could not see Porter. Porter could not see Smith. They were joined by a length of rubber intercom cord, and by nothing else in the world. And for the next several hours, everything that happened would happen through that cord. The Black Widow climbed 8,000 feet. Smith leveled off and turned north, out over the water, into the corridor the Japanese used, and then he flew in circles in the dark and waited, which is what night fighting actually is. This is the part nobody puts in the movies. Most night interceptions never happened at all. The sky is not a room. The sky is an ocean, stacked on top of an ocean. Thousands of cubic miles of empty air. And two aircraft moving through it at 300 miles an hour will pass within 5 miles of each other and never know. Even with radar, especially with radar, because radar only sees where it is pointed, and a man in a coffin-sized compartment staring at a green tube has to guess where to point it. For the first stretch of that night, there was nothing, just the engines, which after a while stopped being a sound and become a texture, just the smell of hot metal and hydraulic fluid and rubber, just Smith's own breathing in the mask. Then Porter said something, and the night began. There was a contact. Understand what a contact was. It was not an airplane. It was a small, bright irregularity on a piece of glass. A smear that might have been an aircraft, or might have been an echo bouncing off a cloud, or off the sea, or off nothing at all. It gave you a direction and a rough range. It did not tell you what the target was, or how fast it was going, or whether it was one of yours. Porter watched it for several sweeps before he said anything, because saying something meant committing the aircraft, and Porter did not commit lightly. Then he gave Smith a heading, and Smith turned onto it, and the hunt started. The corrections came in a low voice, unhurried, over and over, a few degrees left, a little down, hold that the target was crossing ahead of them, and Smith could not see it and would not see it for a long time. He flew where the voice told him to fly. He watched the instruments. He held the airplane steady while a man he could not see stared into a tube and did geometry in his head. 4 miles, 3. 4. At 2 miles, Porter said the target was climbing, and Smith climbed after it, and the target entered cloud. Cloud at night is a different order of blindness. Inside cloud, the landing lights are useless, and the exhaust flames of your own engines bloom back at you off the moisture and ruin what little night vision you have. Inside cloud, the radar return breaks up. The target goes soft on the scope, smears, double, sometimes disappears entirely for a sweep or two, and then comes back somewhere it should not be. And the target inside that cloud was a machine the Americans had named Irving. The Japanese called it something else. It was a twin-engine aircraft, long and clean, built originally as a heavy escort fighter and used by that stage of the war for reconnaissance and for night work of its own. It was not a bomber. It was not a lumbering thing full of bombs. It was a fast, capable aircraft with a crew who knew their business, and it was doing what an experienced crew does when it is uneasy. It was going through the weather rather than around it. Smith went in after it. What followed lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes. Say that out loud, and it sounds like nothing. 7 minutes is a cup of coffee. 7 minutes is the walk to the mailbox. Now sit in a black box in cloud at 8,000 feet over an ocean at night, holding an aircraft the size of a house within 100 feet of a stall on the inside of a turn. You cannot see the end of, while a voice in your ear reads you numbers, and understand that the numbers are the only thing standing between you and in the water. In and out of the cloud they went. The Irving would run into a bank and Porter would lose the return and find it again. The Irving would come out into clear air and there would be nothing, no shape, no exhaust, nothing. Because clear air at night over the ocean is not clear. Then back into cloud, then out 7 minutes. And in all that time, the crew of the Irving almost certainly did not know they were being followed. That is the part that catches in the throat. They were flying through the weather because the weather was there. They changed altitude because a pilot changes altitude. They had no radar. They had no tail warning device. There was no equipment aboard that aircraft capable of telling them that something enormous was behind them. Matching every turn, closing 100 yards at a time, the gap came down, a mile, half a mile, 1,000 yards. In the last few hundred yards, Porter's usefulness came to an end. The return had told him where, it could never tell him what, and in close, inside the minimum range of the set, it would not tell him anything at all. The hunter's eyes were gone. Smith lifted his head. For 1 second there was nothing out there. Then there was a shape, blacker than the black, 2 faint smears of orange where the exhaust stacks were, so faint that if he had blinked he would have lost it. He put the illuminated ring of his gun sight on the shape. He eased the throttles. He went closer, closer than doctrine, closer than sense. He was not a good shot. And he knew it. And he had one remedy for it. He fired. The 4 cannons under his feet made a sound that came up through the airframe more than through the air. A hard, flat hammering. And the tracer went out ahead of him in short red lines that seemed to travel slowly and then vanish. 2 seconds, maybe less. The Irving came apart. There is no gentler way to write it. 20-millimeter high explosive shells do not punch holes. They open things, and the aircraft opened, and the fuel in its wing found the fire, and the whole shape turned into a white-orange bloom that lit the underside of the cloud for a mile in every direction. For 1 instant, Carroll Smith could see everything, the cloud above him, the water below him, his own wing, gloss black, with light running along it. Then the burning thing fell away underneath, and the dark closed over the hole it had made. Porter, who had done all the hunting, saw none of it. They had been airborne for a while now, and Smith had used perhaps 2 seconds of his 20. The second one came almost immediately. This is the detail that historians have never been able to explain, and it is the strangest thing about that night. The Japanese kept coming. The kill Smith had just made was not a discrete event in an empty sky. It was a fire in a stretch of air where other Japanese aircraft were flying, and nothing changed. Nobody scattered. Nobody turned for home. Nobody apparently came up on the radio and said the thing that would have saved the next 3 crews, because they did not know what to say. That is the answer. As near as anyone can get to one. A man in a cockpit 5 miles away sees a flash on the horizon, and what does he report? An explosion, an aircraft down, cause unknown. He does not report an American night fighter with airborne radar because he does not know such a thing exists. He does not report anything useful because he does not have anything useful, and so the men still flying went on flying, straight and level, toward home, in the dark, on the assumption that had kept them alive for 2 years. Porter found the second contact and gave Smith a heading, and the whole grim machinery started again. This one did not climb. This one went down. Down is worse. Down at night, over water, is where night fighters died. Every 100 feet of altitude, a man gives up his 100 feet of margin he no longer has. And the altimeter in a Black Widow was a pressure instrument, and pressure instruments lie off by 50 feet on a bad day, off by more. If the weather is moving, Smith followed it down, 6,000, et fou, Porter's voice, steady, giving corrections that were now not just about interception, but about survival. They caught the second Irving at 800 feet above the Philippine Sea. 800 feet. Think about what that means. Not for the Japanese crew, who were about to die and would never know why. For Smith, he was closing to within a few hundred feet of another aircraft in the dark at 800 feet. And if the burning wreckage went into a spin toward him, he had no room to dive away. And if his own aircraft was damaged by debris, he had perhaps 4 seconds before the water. Doctrine said, do not attack below a safe altitude. Doctrine was written by men sitting at desks in Florida. He put the gun sight on the shape and went closer because he was not a good shot. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. The Irving burned and rolled and went into the water, and the sea took the light and shut it off, the way a hand covers a candle, and the surface of the Philippine Sea was black again as though nothing had ever happened there. Tfo, Smith climbed away. Porter swept the scope, and now, for a stretch of that night, there was nothing at all. This is the part that does not appear in any citation, because there is nothing to cite. Empty sky, empty scope. 2 men in a black airplane at 4,000 feet over an ocean. And the engines and the cold, it is very cold at altitude in an unpressurized aircraft. The heaters in a Black Widow were adequate and no more. Smith would have felt it in his fingers first, then in his feet. The oxygen mask presses on the bridge of the nose. Sweat dries in the small of the back and turns to ice. And the mind, which has been occupied for a quarter of an hour with headings and deflections and the precise moment to squeeze a trigger, is suddenly not occupied at all. Somewhere behind him and below him, in the water, were 2 aircraft, and the men who had been inside them, Smith did not know their names. He never would. He did not know how many there had been, or how old they were, or which of them had been flying and which had been sitting in the back doing what Porter was doing right now, hunched over a piece of equipment, useful, essential, and completely unable to see what was about to happen. Nobody in either aircraft had ever seen anybody in the other. That is what killing looked like in a night fighter. It looked like arithmetic, and then briefly like a fire, and then like nothing. Porter did not speak. There was nothing to report. The scope was clean, the engines droned, the airplane went around a slow circle in the sky, and then a bright irregularity crawled onto the edge of the tube, and Porter said the words, and Smith turned the aircraft toward the third one. This one was different from the start. It was low, not low, the way the second one had been low the way. Nothing had a right to be down where the radar was almost useless. And it was slow, far slower than an Irving, and it was alone. It was a float plane. The Americans called it Rufe. It was a Zero fighter that somebody had bolted a great ungainly float to a single-engine aircraft with a pontoon hanging under it like a swallowed anchor. And it should not have been a threat to anything. It was slow. It was draggy. In daylight, a roof pilot who met an American fighter had perhaps a minute to live. At night, at 200 feet above the water, a Rufe was nearly untouchable. And here is why. Radar does not know the difference between an airplane and the ocean. It throws out a pulse and it listens for a return. And when the aircraft it is hunting is only 200 feet above the surface of the sea, the pulse comes back from the aircraft, and it also comes back from the water and from the swell and from the crests of the waves, and all of that returning energy arrives at almost exactly the same instant. What appears on the scope is not a bright shape against a dark field. What appears is a mess. The bottom of Porter's tube would have been a smeared band of light, a wall of it, and somewhere inside that wall, indistinguishable to any man who was not extraordinary at his job, was the thing they were hunting. They call it sea return. Every radar operator in the war knew it and hated it. It was not a malfunction. It was physics, and there was no fixing it. and it meant that a pilot who flew low enough became invisible to the only device that could find him. The roof pilot was flying at 200 feet. He may have been doing it on purpose. He may have been navigating by the look of the water, or nursing a damaged aircraft, or simply flying the way floatplane pilots fly, which is low. It makes no difference. Now, what matters is that the one aircraft in the Philippine Sea that night, which had, by pure accident, positioned itself in the exact place where American radar could not function, was hunted anyway. Smith went down after him at 200 feet at night over water with no horizon. Read that again and hold it. The altimeter is off by 50 feet. The sea is invisible. There is no line where the water ends and the air begins. A pilot descending into that has literally no way of knowing when he has arrived except the instrument which lies and the voice of a man behind him who is looking at a screen full of the ocean. Porter kept him alive. That is the only honest way to describe what he did in the next few minutes. He had to sort a single dim return out of a wall of sea clutter, hold it, and simultaneously watch the closure rate of an aircraft that was descending toward the surface with a pilot who could not see the surface. Any error was final, a 10-degree mistake, and the Black Widow flies into the water at 300 miles an hour. And there is no wreckage and no report, and 2 names go on a list. They chased that float plane low over the sea. Smith described it afterward. He said it was like trying to catch a greased pig in a barrel. There is a whole night inside that sentence. The exasperation in it, the almost comic frustration of a man in an aircraft weighing more than 20,000 pounds empty, with 4 cannons in its belly, trying to get a shot at a hobbled little float plane that kept sliding out of his sights because both of them were flying in a place where neither of them could see anything. The roof would drift out of the gun sight, and Smith would correct and overshoot and correct again. And all the while a voice was reading him numbers, and all the while the water was 200 feet under his belly. He caught it. Eventually, at a range where missing was, as always, physically difficult, he caught it. The float plane went into the sea. Some accounts say the fire on the water burned for a while afterward, which it may have done, because there was nowhere else for it to go. And still, the Japanese kept flying. There was a 4th aircraft in that sky, and it was the one that should have won. The Americans called it Frank. It was a Nakajima single-engine fighter, the best the Japanese Army put into large-scale service in the war, and it was not a bomber, and it was not a float plane, and it was not a reconnaissance machine caught out of position. It was a fighter, and it was flown by a fighter pilot, and on paper it beat the Black Widow at everything. Consider the numbers, which are not close. A Frank was good for something like 390 miles an hour. A Black Widow, flat out, on a good day, with everything trimmed, made 366. The Frank was 25 miles an hour faster in level flight, and the gap widened in a climb. It turned tighter, it rolled faster. It was a fraction of the size, a single-seat aircraft with 1 man in it, and it carried cannons of its own. If that Japanese pilot had ever once looked over his shoulder in daylight and seen a Black Widow behind him, the fight would have been over in 30 seconds, and Carroll Smith and Philip Porter would be a footnote in somebody else's story. He did not look over his shoulder. He could not have seen anything if he had, and this is the cruelty of the whole night. The thing that makes it sit badly in the chest even now. More than 80 years later, the Frank pilot's aircraft was superior. His flying may well have been superior. Every advantage he possessed was an advantage that required him to see, and he was flying inside a darkness that he had been taught to think of as a friend, a darkness that had protected Japanese aircrew for 2 full years, and the darkness had quietly stopped working. The thing that killed him was not a better airplane. It was a better idea sitting in a compartment behind the pilot. Wearing a headset, Porter brought them in 5 miles. Fool 3. Smith trimmed the aircraft and held it and did not touch the throttles more than he had to. Because a Black Widow overtaking a Frank has no margin at all and cannot afford to bleed speed, 2 miles, half a mile in close. The return slid off the scope and Porter went blind. And Smith looked up, and there, against a sky that was very slightly less black than the aircraft in front of it, was the shape. He went closer. He always went closer. He put the ring on it, and he held the airplane still. And every foot he gained was a foot he might not have, because the aircraft ahead of him could simply push its throttle forward and be gone forever. It never did. Smith fired, and it was over. He turned the Black Widow south toward Mindoro, toward a line of kerosene lamps on a strip of crushed coral. And behind him, the Philippine Sea was as black and as empty as it had been at sunset. And there was no evidence at all that anything had happened. And there would not be until first light in the morning. The armorers pulled the ammunition trays out of the belly of the aircraft and counted what was gone. 382 rounds, 4 aircraft, 382 rounds of 20 millimeter, out of 800, something like 10 seconds of firing, spread across an entire night, spread across 4 separate men in 4 separate machines, who each had, at the end, no idea what had found them. Read that number the way the armorers read it. It does not say that Carroll Smith was a marksman. He had told anyone who asked that he was not. It says something colder. It says that 4 times in one night, a man flew an enormous aircraft to within a few hundred feet of an enemy who could not see him, aimed carefully at a shape he could barely make out, and squeezed the trigger for 2 seconds. Because at that distance, it was not really possible to miss. The Japanese never understood what happened over Mindoro that night. How could they? 3 of the 4 aircraft went into the water without a radio call worth making. The 4th, the Frank, the best fighter in the sky, was flown by a man who never saw the thing behind him. There was no report to file. There was no lesson to be learned and passed down to the next crew. Going out the following night, there was only a gap where 4 aircraft should have come home, and the following night, the ones who came after them flew out over the same water, in the same darkness, believing exactly what the dead men had believed. Finding Mindoro, again, was its own kind of work. Porter navigated them home the way he had hunted, by looking at a screen. The island came up on the tube as a great irregular mass of return, coastline and hills and the shallow water lying against the beach. And somewhere on the southwestern edge of that mass was a strip of crushed coral with a line of kerosene lamps burning on it. A dozen lamps, give or take, from 5 miles out, in the dark, they looked like nothing. A dozen dim yellow points on a black island in a black sea, and if a man let his attention drift for half a minute, he could lose them entirely and fly past the whole island without knowing. There was no instrument landing system. There was no approach lighting. There were no crash barriers and no overrun. The strip had been finished only days before by the same engineers who had spent every night of the previous fortnight lying in flooded slit trenches. And it was long enough for a Black Widow, and not much longer. Smith brought it down. The main wheels found the coral, and the airplane rolled out and slowed. And at the far end, the ground crew came out of the dark with flashlights and walked him into the revetment. And the 2 engines coughed and stopped, and for the first time in hours, there was silence. 2 men climbed out of a black airplane onto an island in the Philippines. The armorers pulled the trays. The intelligence officers came with their clipboards and asked their questions, times, headings, altitude, aircraft types. Smith answered from memory. because there was no other place to answer from. There was no film worth looking at. Gun camera footage from a night fighter shows a bright bloom in a black frame and proves almost nothing. What confirmed those 4 aircraft were the ground radar plots and the men on the beach who had watched fires fall out of the sky and go into the water, and the wreckage that came ashore later. 4 Japanese aircraft in a single night by a single crew. No American night fighter crew in any theater of the war did that again. Somebody painted the marks on the nose of the airplane, alongside the words that were already there. The Black Widow Carol Smith carried a name the way most of them did, and the name that has come down to us is Time's a-wastin', although even that small fact has been argued over by people who care about such things, because the records of night fighter squadrons are thin, and the men who kept them had other work to do. That is the first thing to understand about what happened after almost nothing was written down. There was no press conference. There was no war correspondent in the revetment at 2 a.m. with a notebook. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron was a small unit doing secret work with a secret device, and the device was the reason for their success. And the last thing anyone in that squadron wanted was a newspaper story explaining to the Japanese exactly how 4 of their aircraft had vanished over the Philippine Sea. So the squadron went back to work the following night, and the night after that, and the night after that, and the engineers kept laying coral. This is the part of the story that matters. And it is the part that is almost never told, because it is not dramatic, and it does not involve anybody firing anything. The strips at San Jose were finished on the 9th of January, 1945. The United States Sixth Army went ashore at Lingayen Gulf on the island of Luzon in the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. Something like 68,000 men landed on the first day. Over the beaches, over the transports, over the men wading through the surf with their rifles held above their heads, there were American fighters. Those fighters flew from Mindoro. They flew from the strips that the engineers built while lying in trenches at night. They flew from the strips that Carol Smith and Philip Porter and the rest of that squadron went up into the dark to protect night after night. In an airplane that most of the Army Air Forces regarded as an oddity, 4 aircraft shot down on one night did not win the Pacific War. Nothing that any single crew did on any single night won that war. But 4 aircraft that did not reach Mindoro meant bombs that did not fall on a construction crew, and a construction crew that was not killed meant a runway that was finished on schedule, and a runway finished on schedule meant air cover over 68,000 men on a beach in January. That is what those 4 kills bought. Not glory. A morning of ordinary work for a group of exhausted men with bulldozers, who never knew any of it had happened. Now, here is the part that sits strangely. In the middle of January, a few weeks after the greatest single night any American night fighter crew ever had, a captain named William B. Sellers arrived at the squadron. He had come to relieve Major Carol Smith as commanding officer. That is the entire record. That is all of it. A line in a unit history, no explanation is given, and it would be dishonest to invent one. Officers are rotated, comme en change. A man who's been at war for a long time gets sent somewhere else, and the machine that sent him there does not stop to consider what he did in December. So there was no ceremony that anyone recorded. There was a captain, and there was a major, and there was a handover, and the war went on north to Luzon. Without them, Philip Porter drops out of the story almost entirely at this point, which is unbearable when you consider what he did. Every one of those 4 aircraft was found by him. Every intercept was flown on his voice. He sat in a compartment barely wider than his own shoulders, with his face in a green tube, and he hunted 4 aircraft to their destruction, and he never saw any of them. Not one, not for a second. And then the paperwork closed over him. Carol Smith went home. He did not, as far as anyone has been able to find, write a memoir. He did not tour the country giving speeches. He gave a few plain answers to a few plain questions, and one of them was the line about his marksmanship improving in direct relation to how close he got, and another was the line about the float plane and the greased pig in the barrel. And these two sentences are very nearly all we have of his voice. Think about the proportion of that. We know to the round how much ammunition he expended, 382. We do not know the name of a single man he killed, not one. 4 aircraft went into the Philippine Sea that night, and inside them were men. The 2 Irvings carried crews, more than 1 man in each. The floatplane pilot was alone in his cockpit with a pontoon slung beneath him. The fighter pilot was alone too, flying the best machine the Japanese Army had, straight and level, toward a base he would never reach. They had names, they had mothers. Somewhere in Japan, 4 sets of families waited through 1945 and got a notification, or got nothing at all, which was more common, and in every account of that night written in English in the 80 years and more since, they appear as 4 aircraft types, 4 entries in a list. Pour confirmation on a forme. They did not even know what killed them. That is the true weight of that night, and it is the reason it should be remembered rather than celebrated. Carroll Smith was not a monster. He was a man doing a job in a war his country had not started, protecting men on the ground who would otherwise have died, and if he had not flown that night, somebody else would have. But the thing he did was not a duel. It was not 2 knights meeting in the sky. It was a machine that could see, finding men who could not see, and killing them from behind at a range at which missing was not really possible. That is what airborne radar was. That is what it has been ever since. The Black Widow itself did not last. More than 700 of them were built. They flew in Europe and in the Pacific, in China and Burma and India and over the Mediterranean. And in the last year of the war, they owned the night in every theater where they operated. Then the war ended, and the jets came, and the great black airplane with the plastic nose and the useless turret was suddenly a relic of a technology that had already passed it. They were flown to storage fields. They were sold. They were cut up and melted into ingots and turned into whatever it is that scrap aluminum becomes. Today there are 4 Northrop Black Widows left on Earth. 4 out of more than 700. Not one of them is the airplane that flew that night. If you go and stand in front of one of the survivors in a museum, you can see the plastic cone on the nose where the radar sat. And you can look up at the belly and find the 4 square ports where the cannons fired. And you can see how enormous it is, how absurdly, impossibly large for something that was supposed to sneak up behind people. And you can stand there and think about a moonless night over the Philippine Sea, and 2 men in separate compartments, joined by a rubber cord, and 4 other men flying home in the dark, unafraid, absolutely certain that nothing in the world could find them there. They were right about the darkness. They were only wrong about the machine.